Thank you all. I think it's been an incredible morning, and just a couple of very quick points. I think between the data that Amy presented when we started and the words we heard from some of the other regions around the country that are doing this successfully, is this can be done. And if this region relies on the data, focuses on the facts, if it looks at what are the industry assets that are being underleveraged, gets the private sector, frankly, into the driver's seat, and realizes it can't do business in the same old way, there is so much that this region can accomplish. So, as I said when I started, there would be no one better to kind of sum up this effort than David Rubenstein, who, despite the fact that his mother wanted him to be a dentist, has still done okay for himself. Becoming the co-founder and co-chief executive officer of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms. David is the co-chairman of the board of trustees of the Brookings Institution, and in his spare time serves as president of the Economic Club of Washington, which frankly is playing an increasingly important role in driving awareness of the Washington region as a global business destination. Please join me in welcoming David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And I want to thank everybody from JPMorgan Chase and Brookings for putting this session together, and thank all of you for coming. How many people here are natives of the Washington area? Okay. How many people moved here in the last 5 years? Last 10 years? 15 years? 20 years? 25 years? Oh, wow. How many people here want their children to live in this area? How many people want their children to live somewhere else? Oh, wow. You don't like your children very much. Okay. How many people came here because the federal government drew you here? How many came because of private sector initiatives? How many people didn't have a job and were just coming just because they wanted something to do? Okay. All right. University. How many came because of universities? Okay. How many people got their degrees in this area? Okay. How many people here would like to move out of the Washington area? Wow. How many people are planning to move right now after today to Washington area? Anybody? Jeez. Okay. Let me tell you a bit why you are in the Washington, D.C. area now. Let me just give you a little history lesson. Bear with me for 5 minutes. On June the 10th, 1790, Thomas Jefferson went to see George Washington in the capital of the country, then New York. He had an arrangement to see George Washington and had the meeting. And as he was leaving, a rival of Thomas Jefferson came in to also meet with George Washington. These two rivals, Jefferson was Secretary of State, Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. They didn't get along. They had different views on how government should work. But Jefferson invited Hamilton to come to have dinner with him later that night. And Hamilton really hadn't had a lot of dinners with Jefferson. They sparred a lot, but he said, okay. And then Jefferson went to Madison, who was his good friend, and James Madison said, why don't you come? Madison was then a member of the new Congress. So they had a dinner, and think about this dinner. How would you like to be a fly on the wall there? Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And what did they talk about? Well, there was a dispute at that time about where the federal government's headquarters should be. It was then in New York City. And people in the South, particularly the Virginians like Madison and Jefferson and Washington, thought where could be a better place than Virginia? There was a problem, though, that the Virginians and the Southerners did not want something that Hamilton and the Northerners wanted. What the Northerners wanted was to have the existing $25 million of Revolutionary War debt paid off by the entire country. Most of that debt was actually now owned by the northern states. The southern states had already paid off their Revolutionary War debt. So the southern states said, wait a second, why should we pay off this $25 million of debt that the federal government will then have to absorb and we'll pay our taxes towards it? We've already paid off our Revolutionary War debt. So at this dinner, what they decided was they'd cut a deal. And Washington, D.C. is a place where a lot of deals are cut. This was in New York. But the deal was basically this. The federal government would be allowed to assume the debt, the $25 million of debt, and therefore the southern states would pay their pro rata share, presumably. And in return, the capital would be moved south. Now, they didn't say exactly where. Madison and Jefferson thought it would be picked in Virginia, but it was recognized that George Washington would select the site, and he was favoring something on the Potomac, maybe because he owned land around here, who knows. But that was the deal, and Congress ultimately ratified that. And so the deal was that New York would lose the capital shortly thereafter. It would go for 10 years in Philadelphia, and then it would come to the site designated by George Washington. Washington came down and being charged, although he was President of the United States, he was also in charge of figuring out where we're going to move the capital of the United States. He came here, he looked around the Potomac and picked a site that is right where we are now. Then the process began of building this city. And George Washington was deeply involved in it. And what he said is, I don't want just a government city. I want a city that is a great metropolis, not unlike London and Paris. In fact, he picked Pierre L'Enfant, a Frenchman, to draw up a grand design for the city that would be a capital city, because George Washington said, if we're only a government city, it won't prosper. We have to have a great universities. We have to have a cultural center. We need to have a business enterprise. And in fact, he planned for a big central market here for business operations. Unfortunately, Pierre L'Enfant got fired because he was difficult to deal with at some points. And secondly, they didn't have the money to really build out the capital. And as a result, it took quite a while. They had to have a lottery. It really struggled. And when the federal government actually did move down here in 1801, there were only 5,000 residents in this area and 130 government employees. And Washington became a government city, as we all know. And I'd say through World War II was basically a government city. And then after World War II, and then really after the 1960s, as more and more people flocked to Washington, the city became more than a government-oriented town. It became a business enterprise. And the idea that Washington would be more than a government enterprise really took hold. And while it's had its difficulties because you have different jurisdictions, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, the idea has taken hold that Washington can be more than it has been just a government city. Now, you might say, well, what's so bad about being a government city? Well, if you take a look at the great cities in the world and the great capitals in the world, London or Paris or Tokyo, they are more than just cities that depend on government. They are cities that have moved past just being government cities. They are cities that have great education centers, great cultural centers, great business centers, and they work together in ways that make that city much greater. Now, why should we care about that? You might say, what's the big difference? Who cares if Washington is only a government city? What difference does it really make? I'm living here, I'm pretty happy, except for the couple people here who want to move out. People here are pretty happy. Well, the answer, I think, is this. Remember Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote these famous words in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote a sentence that became the most famous sentence in the history of the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What's life all about? Obviously, without hurting other people, it's about pursuing happiness, raising your children, having a family, taking advantage of the brain that you have, getting educated, creating something, making yourself feel that you have done something with your life that justifies your existence on the face of the earth. All of us have reached the point in life, probably we say, all right, what are we doing here? We want to do something useful. We want to make sure that we are productive human beings. Well, I think one of the lessons we've learned out of life is that when you live in an environment that stimulates you, when you live in an environment where there are great cultural facilities, when there are great educational facilities, when there are great job opportunities, you get people to come together, they work together, you recruit and get much greater people coming together with greater talents. In the end, you create more happiness. Happiness, I think, is not just a function of size, of course, but I think of the Washington area, which is already the most important area and city in the world in one respect. Washington, D.C. is the most powerful city in the world. When our president does something, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve does something, when our congressional leaders do something, when our military leaders do something, it gets attention all over the world. Everybody pays attention to Washington for what the government does. But because we have so much global business interest now, and we've become much more of a city than just a government city, we can, if we pull together all the government resources, but particularly the private sector resources, and get them to work together, we can become London and Paris and Tokyo in the sense that we have a city that's not dependent just on government. And as a result, we're going to pull together and get more people to come here who are going to be educated, people who want to stay here. We're going to create greater wealth. If there is greater wealth in the entire region, I think everybody will ultimately benefit. The philanthropic organizations will benefit. I think we'll have better schools. We'll have people who come here and really, I think, do great things for our country. So the reason this is important to Brookings and to JPMorgan Chase and to me personally is that I've made my own bet in Washington, D.C. I moved here many years ago. The city has changed a great deal since I've been here. The most important change, I would say, is not that the government has gotten bigger. It's actually relatively speaking, hasn't gotten all that much bigger in some respects. It's the business community has become so much bigger. There's a technology community, there's an educational community, there's a philanthropic community, there's a cultural community that didn't exist here when I first came, by and large, many, many years ago. And I think what we should want for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren is to make sure that Washington becomes not only the greatest government city in the world, but the greatest city in the world. And that would live up to what George Washington really wanted. What he really wanted was a city that would be not just a government city, but a cultural city, a business city, a city where people would want to get educated. And I think it's within our grasp to do this. I think the work that Brookings and JPMorgan Chase have done have given us a good roadmap about how to do that, and I hope all of you will feel that you learn something about the importance of this. Again, the most important thing is, why should we do this? We should do this because in the end it's going to make us happier people, it's going to make our children happier and have more resources, and I think in the end it'll make the city a city that we all are going to be proud of, to say we live in Washington, D.C. area because this is the greatest city on the face of the earth, not because it's the most powerful city, but because we have the greatest cultural organizations, the greatest philanthropic organizations, and we have the most important businesses in the world here. So I hope all of you will feel, as a result of this conference, maybe there's a sense that maybe we could work together more. We should find some people that can pull us together and make sure the business community in Maryland and Virginia and D.C. work together more, not just on things that affect our day-to-day lives here, but things that are going to affect the world. Because what we can do here is produce things that are going to be important for the rest of the world, and we can also teach the rest of the world how we can live together in an area which has government and business and many different jurisdictions. We can be a role model for the rest of the world and also make our own lives and our children's lives much better. So thank you very much for coming. I want to thank Brookings and JPMorgan for what they've done. Thank you all for your attention and interest. Thank you.
So as we suspected, there is no one who could have said it better than David Rubenstein. So I will just say thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation. We hope to have, in the months and years ahead, continue our work together to really make this a true global city. Thank you all very much.